Be next. And then I'm going to move to the right side of the room.
Mr.
Your
Chairman,
name for the record, please?
Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
can
My
we just
name's
ask if they're a Haverhill resident or not? You don't have to give a street, but would you ask them if they're just tell us if they're a Haverhill
Oh, that's
resident?
fine. Yeah, we do have their street addresses in writing. We didn't want people to have to necessarily divulge their address, but
Oh, just their city?
yeah, that's fine. So could I have your name and where you are from?
Yeah, my name's Ben Roy. I grew up here in Haverhill.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking here on occupied land, the occupied lands of the Abenaki, Pentucket, Wabanaki, Pennacook, and Pawtucket peoples. And I'd like to say 5 things tonight. First, I'd like to say that the statue of Hannah Dustin in GIR Park was erected in the late 19th century out of a sense of ethnic pride in the white race and in support of the continued genocide of indigenous peoples in the west of this continent. It was erected as a symbol of white supremacy and of indigenous inferiority, and therefore it has no place in our diverse and multicultural community. It should be removed from GIR Park and brought to the Buttonwoods Museum, I think, where it can serve as an example of colonial and white supremacist propaganda when the darker parts of our city's history are taught, among other interpretations. If Buttonwoods will not take the statue and it has no other home in the city, I suggest perhaps it be melted down and the metal reused to make a statue of the local indigenous people's choosing. Second, I'd like to say that if the Haverhill City government does not decide to remove the statue from GIR Park, I think that is tantamount to endorsing the white supremacist message contained within the statue. Changing the wording on the plaque about the base of the statue does not mitigate the violence of the statue itself. According to the Pleasant Grove City versus Suman Supreme Court decision here in the United States, there was a ruling that monuments on government property are a form of government speech regardless of who originally paid for that monument. This means that for the last 141 years, the city of Haverhill has been a vocal advocate of white supremacy. Needless to say, this should be an embarrassment to all of us here in Haverhill of the highest degree. And if history is kind to this city and this government and the previous governments, perhaps it will say that this was a monstrous oversight and be forgiving. But if, in light of all this information and testimony, the choice is to leave this diabolical symbol of hate right where it is, I fear that history will have little kindness for this city and we will not be remembered well. 3, I'd like to say that Hannah Dustin is not a feminist icon unless you exclude indigenous women and girls, among whom were the victims of Hannah Dustin, from your concept of womanhood and femininity. And if you do exclude indigenous women and girls, then I would say that you are not a feminist. Number 4, removing the Hannah Dustin statue from GIR Park is not erasing history, especially if it is moved to the Buttonwoods Museum or some other location off of city property in the city. There are plenty of books, articles, short films, and other works of art depicting Hannah Dustin and her story, many of which have been mentioned here before me tonight. And the removal of this really indefensible excuse for a symbol of patriotism, I don't think will leave her story forgotten if that is something to be feared in the first place. 5, I hope that this is the beginning, a sort of catalyst for future debate and discussion in our city on topics such as decolonization and our history and how we can continue to shape history going forward. I would also like to point out that on Monday, this coming Monday, is Indigenous Peoples Day, and I think it would be a great way to acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day by our city coming together and removing this racist symbol from our city property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. As I said, no